I'd been working the late shift at the warehouse for almost 3 years without missing many nights. Every evening ended exactly the same way, with me clocking out around 11:30 and heading toward my old pickup truck. The parking lot was always quiet, except for the distant humming of forklifts being shut down inside the building. Most of the guys I worked with lived in the opposite direction, so I usually drove home alone. I actually liked those lonely drives because they gave me time to unwind after dealing with noisy machines and demanding supervisors. The highway home cut through miles of empty farmland and thick patches of forest before reaching my neighborhood. There were only a handful of gas stations open that late, and after midnight the roads were almost completely deserted. I kept a cup of black coffee in the holder, turned on classic rock, and let the miles disappear beneath the tires. Nothing unusual had ever happened during those drives. At least that's what I believed until one Tuesday night changed everything. That Tuesday started like every other shift, busy and exhausting. My shoulders hurt from lifting heavy boxes for nearly 10 hours straight. By the time I finally punched out, rain clouds had rolled over the entire county. A cold drizzle covered the windshield before I even started the engine. The weather forecast mentioned scattered storms, but nothing serious enough to worry about. I turned on the wipers, pulled onto the highway, and watched the city lights slowly fade behind me. The farther I drove, the darker everything became. Eventually, the only light came from my headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I had no idea something else was already watching those headlights from somewhere beyond the trees. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed a figure standing near an old bus stop that hadn't been used in years. At first, I assumed it was someone waiting for a ride or maybe a stranded driver, but as I got closer, something felt wrong. The person wasn't waving or moving at all. They simply stood there facing the road with their arms hanging stiffly at their sides. Rain poured over them, yet they didn't seem bothered by it. Their clothes looked unusually dark, almost blending into the night itself. When my headlights finally reached their face, I couldn't make out any features. It was like the rain swallowed every detail before I could see it clearly. I kept driving because stopping out there wasn't exactly safe. My eyes stayed locked on the rearview mirror after I passed the figure. For several seconds, they remained exactly where they had been. Then lightning flashed across the sky. For just a split second, I saw the bus stop completely empty. The person had vanished without walking anywhere. There wasn't enough time for anyone to run into the woods. My stomach tightened, but I convinced myself the rain and lightning had played tricks on my eyes. That's what I wanted to believe anyway. When I reached the next gas station, I decided to grab another coffee. The clerk looked half asleep behind the counter and barely acknowledged me. While paying, I casually mentioned seeing someone standing by the abandoned bus stop. His expression changed immediately. He stopped scanning my coffee for a second before quietly asking, "Around midnight?" I nodded without thinking much about it. He sighed deeply and stared toward the dark windows. Then he simply said, "You're not the first person." Naturally, I asked him what he meant. The clerk hesitated like he regretted saying anything at all. Finally, he admitted that several truck drivers had reported seeing someone standing in that exact spot over the last few months. None of them ever saw the person's face. Every story ended with the figure disappearing before anyone could get close. A couple of drivers even claimed the person somehow appeared farther down the road minutes later. I laughed nervously because the stories sounded ridiculous. Still, the clerk never smiled once. Before I left, he quietly told me, "If you ever see him twice in one night, don't stop." That warning stayed in my mind the entire drive home. Every shadow along the road suddenly looked suspicious. Every mailbox seemed shaped like a person standing beside the pavement. The rain continued falling harder until visibility became terrible. My windshield wipers struggled to keep up. The radio began cutting in and out with bursts of static. Eventually, I turned it off because the crackling noise felt more unsettling than silence. That's when I noticed another figure standing ahead. This time, it wasn't near the bus stop. It stood beside an old wooden fence almost 15 miles farther down the highway. My heartbeat immediately sped up. The posture looked exactly the same, arms hanging straight, head tilted slightly downward, completely motionless despite the heavy rain. I slowed down without realizing it. As my headlights reached the figure, I noticed something impossible. The clothes looked identical to the person I'd already passed earlier. Every logical explanation disappeared from my mind. There was no possible way the same person could have traveled that far in less than 15 minutes without a vehicle. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My truck rolled past the figure at about 20 miles an hour. I refused to look directly at its face this time. Instead, I stared straight ahead until it disappeared behind me. Then curiosity got the better of me. I glanced into the side mirror. The road behind me was completely empty. I remembered exactly what the gas station clerk had said. If you ever see him twice in one night, don't stop. My foot instinctively pressed harder on the gas pedal. The truck accelerated while the engine growled through the storm. I told myself I was being irrational, yet deep inside I couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that whoever or whatever I had just passed wasn't standing still anymore. For the rest of the drive, I refused to check my mirrors again. I focused only on reaching home alive. Unfortunately, home wasn't as safe as I believed, because something had already arrived there before I did. When I finally turned onto my street, the storm had almost completely stopped. The rain faded into a light mist that clung to the pavement like smoke. Every house was dark except for the porch lights people left on overnight. My neighborhood had always felt safe, the kind of place where kids still rode bicycles and neighbors waved at each other every morning. I pulled into my driveway and immediately noticed something strange. My front porch light was off, even though I never left it off at night. I frowned, assuming the bulb had burned out during the storm. As I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something stepped behind the large oak tree at the edge of my yard. I froze beside my truck with my keys still in my hand. The yard was quiet except for water dripping from the branches overhead. My eyes stayed locked on the tree, waiting for whoever had been standing there to step back out. Nothing happened for almost a full minute. I finally laughed at myself, blaming exhaustion after another long shift. I walked quickly to the front door and unlocked it without taking another look toward the tree. As soon as I stepped inside, I locked every deadbolt out of habit. My dog, Cooper, usually greeted me the second I came home. That night he was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I heard a low growl coming from the hallway. Cooper wasn't an aggressive dog. He was a 7-year-old Labrador who loved everyone, including delivery drivers and complete strangers. Hearing him growl like that instantly put me on edge. I slowly walked toward the hallway and found him standing completely still outside my bedroom. His ears were flat against his head, and every hair along his back stood straight up. He wasn't looking at me, he was staring at the bedroom door. His growling became deeper, almost vibrating through the floor. Then the bedroom doorknob slowly turned by itself. It moved only an inch before stopping completely. I rushed forward and threw the bedroom door open. The room was completely empty. My windows were locked from the inside. The closet door stood open, but there was nothing inside except hanging clothes. Cooper cautiously entered behind me, sniffing every corner without barking. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains, even inside the bathroom. Nothing. I stood there trying to slow my breathing while telling myself the old house probably shifted during storms, but deep down I knew what I'd seen. That doorknob hadn't moved because of the wind. Sleep wasn't an option after that. I made another pot of coffee and sat in the living room with every light turned on. The television played quietly in the background, though I wasn't paying attention to it. Around 2:30 in the morning, Cooper suddenly lifted his head. His eyes locked on the front window. The growling started again, louder this time. I slowly stood and looked through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing except my own reflection. Then, lightning flashed far away. For just an instant, someone was standing at the end of my driveway. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, facing my house. The distance made it impossible to see any details, but I recognized the posture immediately. Arms hanging straight, head slightly lowered, the exact same silhouette from the highway. My heartbeat pounded so hard I could hear it inside my ears. I reached for my phone and considered calling the police. Before I could dial, another flash of lightning lit up the yard. The driveway was empty again. Whoever had been standing there was gone. I didn't sleep at all before heading back to work the next evening. My coworkers immediately noticed how tired I looked. One of them joked that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Normally I would have laughed. Instead, I asked if anyone had ever driven past the abandoned bus stop after midnight. The entire break room became strangely quiet. A forklift operator named Mike slowly looked up from his sandwich. He asked me one question. "Did you see it standing still?" My stomach immediately sank. Mike admitted he'd seen the same figure nearly a year earlier. He said it appeared during heavy rain almost every time. He also claimed something followed him home afterward. His wife started hearing footsteps outside their bedroom every night. Their security cameras constantly recorded static whenever someone approached the front porch after midnight. Eventually, they moved to another county. Even then, Mike refused to drive that highway again. He added one detail that made the room feel suddenly colder. It never chooses random people. I asked him what he meant by that. Mike rubbed his tired eyes before answering. Everyone who sees it has one thing in common. Nobody else in the break room spoke. Even the vending machine seemed unusually loud. Mike leaned closer and lowered his voice. They all work late nights. He explained that every report came from warehouse workers, truck drivers, nurses, security guards, or factory employees driving home after midnight. According to him, the figure only appeared to people traveling alone. No one knew why. That night, I seriously considered taking a different route home. It would add nearly 40 minutes to the drive, but I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to avoid that highway forever. My shift ended a little earlier than usual because business was slow. I climbed into my truck and started the engine with trembling hands. As I backed out of the parking space, my headlights swept across the far corner of the employee parking lot. Standing beside the chain-link fence, perfectly still, was the same tall figure. This time it wasn't waiting on the highway anymore. It had come to where I worked.
The moment my headlights landed on the figure standing beside the chain-link fence, every instinct in my body screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't, because there was something unnaturally hypnotic about the way it stood perfectly motionless under the flickering parking lot light, almost as if it had been waiting for me to notice it before making its next move. I slowly rolled down my driver's side window just enough to hear whether anyone else was nearby, but the entire parking lot had fallen into an impossible silence that felt completely disconnected from reality, as though every insect, every passing car, and even the wind itself had suddenly disappeared. My truck engine continued idling, yet somehow it sounded incredibly distant, like I was hearing it from underwater instead of sitting behind the steering wheel. I blinked several times, hoping exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind after another long shift, but the figure remained exactly where it was, without shifting its weight or making the slightest movement. Then I noticed something that instantly made my stomach twist into a knot, because the security light hanging directly above the fence was casting shadows across everything except that figure. The fence had a shadow. The nearby dumpster had a shadow. Even my truck stretched a long shadow across the pavement, but the figure had none at all. My breathing became shallow as I realized I wasn't looking at an ordinary person anymore. Before I could even decide whether to drive away or call someone for help, every light in the parking lot went out at exactly the same moment. When the emergency lights finally flickered back on several seconds later, the fence was completely empty, but muddy footprints were leading directly toward my truck. I slammed the transmission into drive and pulled away so fast that my rear tires briefly spun across the wet asphalt before finally gripping the pavement. And although I told myself not to look into the mirrors because every terrifying story I'd ever heard warned against checking what was behind you, curiosity eventually won the battle after only a few hundred yards. The parking lot was rapidly disappearing behind me, yet I could still clearly make out the chain-link fence illuminated by the distant security lights. Standing exactly where I had first seen it was the same impossibly tall silhouette, but this time it wasn't facing the parking lot anymore, because it was unmistakably facing me, even from hundreds of feet away. There was absolutely no way it should have been visible from that distance through the rain, yet I could somehow tell it was staring directly into my eyes. My hands tightened around the steering wheel until my fingers started aching, but I refused to slow down. Every mile that separated me from the warehouse should have made me feel safer. Instead, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me, because I couldn't shake the feeling that distance no longer mattered to whatever had attached itself to me. My phone suddenly vibrated in the cup holder, nearly making me swerve into the opposite lane. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see a text from work. Instead, the notification simply read, "Unknown number." Before I could answer it, another message appeared containing only two chilling words, "Drive faster." My first reaction was to assume one of my coworkers was trying to scare me with some twisted joke, but the more I thought about it, the less that explanation made sense, because nobody knew I had seen the figure behind the warehouse except me, and I certainly hadn't told anyone that I was leaving at that exact moment. I opened the message while keeping one eye on the road, expecting another prank or maybe a random spam advertisement. Yet there was nothing else written beneath those two words except a timestamp showing the message had somehow been sent nearly 15 minutes before I had even left work. A cold wave spread through my entire body as I checked the sender's information, only to find there wasn't a phone number attached at all. The message appeared to have come from absolutely nowhere. Before I had time to process what I was seeing, another notification appeared on the screen. This one simply said, "Don't stop for anyone." Almost immediately afterward, my phone lost all signal, despite being in an area that normally had excellent reception. The GPS display froze, the radio turned into loud static, even the digital clock on my dashboard began flashing random numbers instead of the correct time. For the first time in my life, I truly felt as though I had driven into a place that no longer belonged to the normal world. About 10 miles farther down the highway, I noticed flashing hazard lights parked along the shoulder ahead, and as I got closer, I could see what appeared to be a woman standing beside a disabled SUV while waving both arms desperately for help, which under any normal circumstances would have been enough for me to pull over without hesitation, because that's simply what decent people do when they see someone stranded late at night. She appeared soaked by the rain and kept glancing nervously toward the dark woods, as though terrified of something hiding between the trees. My foot instinctively lifted off the gas. Then I remembered the mysterious text message telling me not to stop for anyone. I hesitated only briefly before accelerating again. As I drove past the stranded vehicle, I forced myself not to look directly at the woman. Unfortunately, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in my side mirror anyway. Instead of standing beside the SUV, she was facing directly toward my truck, with an unnaturally wide smile stretched across her face. Even worse, the SUV itself had completely vanished from the reflection, leaving her standing alone in an empty field where no road existed. My heart pounded so violently against my chest that it became difficult to breathe normally, and I kept repeating to myself that fatigue, darkness, and fear could easily distort the way a person interpreted ordinary events. Yet every logical explanation continued collapsing under the impossible details unfolding around me. The road ahead suddenly became covered by a layer of dense fog that hadn't existed seconds earlier. My high beams barely reached 20 feet before disappearing into the thick white haze. Every road sign vanished, every familiar landmark disappeared, It felt as though I had entered a completely different highway despite never making a single turn. Even the sound of my tires rolling across the pavement changed into something strangely hollow, almost like I was driving over a massive wooden bridge instead of solid asphalt. The air inside the truck became noticeably colder. My breath started fogging the windshield from the inside. Then, without warning, Cooper's dog tag, which I had accidentally left hanging from my rearview mirror after taking him to the vet, began swinging violently back and forth, even though every window was tightly closed.
The movement of that small metal tag immediately drew my attention because it wasn't swaying naturally the way it would if the truck hit a bump or took a sharp corner. Instead, it was moving in perfectly even arcs, almost as though an invisible hand had reached inside the cab and deliberately pushed it harder with each swing. I watched in disbelief as the tag gradually slowed before stopping completely, only to begin spinning in slow circles entirely on its own. My pulse raced while I searched every mirror, every seat, and every dark corner inside the truck, desperately hoping there was some ordinary explanation hidden in plain sight. There wasn't. Then I heard something that instantly froze every muscle in my body. A soft tapping sound echoed from directly behind my driver's seat. It came once, then twice, then 3 times. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was sitting in the back of my truck. Every horror story I'd ever heard warned against looking directly at whatever was behind you, but fighting human instinct became almost impossible because the tapping continued with slow, deliberate rhythm that sounded disturbingly patient, as though whatever occupied the back seat knew it had all the time in the world. My hand shook uncontrollably while I stared straight ahead, refusing to turn my head even a single inch. The tapping suddenly stopped. The silence that followed felt infinitely worse, because at least the tapping proved something was there, whereas the silence left my imagination to fill every terrifying possibility. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then a cold breath gently brushed against the back of my neck, despite every window remaining firmly closed. My skin erupted in goosebumps. I could smell damp earth mixed with something rotten, like leaves that had been decaying for years beneath standing water. Without thinking, I slammed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared as the truck surged forward through the darkness at nearly 90 miles per hour. The speed should have carried me far beyond that stretch of highway within minutes, yet nothing outside the windshield appeared to change, because the same broken guardrail, the same leaning telephone pole, and the same faded road sign kept passing by again and again, as though I had somehow become trapped inside a never-ending loop that ignored every rule of distance and time. I glanced at the odometer, expecting to see several miles had passed, but the numbers hadn't changed at all. My fuel gauge also remained frozen, despite the engine burning gas at high speed. Panic completely replaced reason. I pounded the steering wheel and shouted every prayer I could remember from childhood. The truck suddenly hit an enormous bump that nearly threw me into the dashboard. Everything went dark for less than a second. When the headlights came back into focus, I found myself parked directly in front of the abandoned bus stop where all of this had begun, even though I should have been nearly 30 miles away by then. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving an unnatural silence hanging over the empty countryside, while a thin layer of fog drifted lazily across the road. And for several terrifying seconds, I simply sat there gripping the steering wheel, because my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. The old wooden bench beneath the bus shelter looked exactly as it had the first night, weathered by years of neglect and covered with peeling paint. Then I noticed there was no longer just one figure standing there. There were 3. Each one wore the same dark clothing. Each one stood with the same unnatural posture. Each one faced directly toward my truck without moving a single inch. Slowly, almost mechanically, all three figures raised one arm at exactly the same time. Instead of pointing toward the road, they pointed directly at my house. I stared in complete disbelief while an unbearable pressure built inside my chest because I suddenly understood that whatever these things wanted had never been about the highway, the warehouse, or the abandoned bus stop, but about leading me somewhere they couldn't reach on their own. And the horrifying realization struck me like ice water as I remembered leaving Cooper alone inside my house only an hour earlier. Without another thought, I threw the truck into reverse before spinning it around so violently that gravel exploded across the pavement behind me. The tires screamed as I raced toward home with every ounce of power the engine could produce. My phone, which had remained completely dead for the last 20 minutes, suddenly powered itself back on. The screen lit up without warning. A live security camera feed from inside my living room appeared automatically. Cooper was standing in the middle of the room, growling at the hallway. Then the camera slowly tilted upward on its own. At the end of the hallway, a tall shadow was silently opening my bedroom door from the inside. The steering wheel nearly slipped from my hands as I stared at the live camera feed instead of the road, because every instinct in my body told me that whatever was inside my house mattered far more than the empty highway rushing beneath my tires. Cooper's growling echoed through the tiny speaker on my phone with such raw panic that it didn't even sound like my dog anymore. The hallway lights inside the house flickered once before going completely dark, leaving only the faint glow from the living room lamp. The shadow standing at the end of the hallway never actually walked forward, yet every time the lights flashed, it somehow appeared several feet closer to the camera without taking a single visible step. I blinked repeatedly, trying to convince myself the poor video quality was causing the strange movement. Then Cooper suddenly stopped growling altogether. He lowered his head, tucked his tail between his legs, and slowly backed away as though he recognized something no human ever could. My phone's speaker filled with a low creaking sound that reminded me of an old wooden floor supporting the weight of someone incredibly heavy. Just before the video froze, I heard a deep voice whisper only 3 words that sent ice through my veins. "You're almost home." I slammed the phone onto the passenger seat because my eyes needed to stay on the highway, yet my mind couldn't escape the terrifying image of that dark figure standing inside my house as though it had been waiting for me all along. Every mile marker I passed felt painfully slow, despite the truck pushing well above the speed limit, and the farther I drove, the more I realized the roads had become unnaturally empty. There were no headlights approaching from the opposite direction, there were no tail lights ahead of me, even the occasional late-night truck traffic had completely disappeared, as though every other driver had mysteriously vanished. My GPS remained frozen on the same location no matter how far I traveled. The dashboard clock continued jumping between random times before eventually displaying nothing but flashing zeros. I reached for the radio again, hoping to hear a weather report or another human voice, but every station produced the same loud static. Hidden beneath the crackling noise was something that almost sounded like distant laughter. As I rounded the final curve before entering my neighborhood, I saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement ahead, and for one brief moment I felt an overwhelming wave of relief because I assumed a police officer had pulled someone over. I slowed my truck and noticed a patrol car parked diagonally across the road, with its emergency lights spinning through the darkness. A uniformed officer stepped into the lane and raised one hand, signaling for me to stop. Under normal circumstances, I would have pulled over immediately, without hesitation. Then I remembered the mysterious messages warning me not to stop for anyone. My heart pounded as I struggled to decide whether I was looking at a real police officer or another trap. The officer never spoke a word. He simply continued raising one hand while keeping his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat.
Then lightning flashed across the sky, and for the briefest instant there was no patrol car, no officer, and no roadblock at all. I drove straight through the place where the police car had supposedly been parked, expecting to hear the impact of metal against metal if it had been real, yet my truck passed through empty air without touching anything. I checked my mirrors immediately afterward and found the highway completely deserted behind me. My pulse refused to slow as I tried making sense of everything that had happened over the last 2 nights, but every explanation sounded more ridiculous than the last. Fatigue couldn't explain disappearing people, hallucinations couldn't send text messages before they happened, broken security cameras couldn't whisper directly to me. The realization settled over me like a heavy weight. Whatever was following me wasn't trying to scare me anymore. It was guiding me towards something, and somehow every path I took led exactly where it wanted me to go. I finally turned onto my street again, but something immediately felt wrong because every house was completely dark, including homes where people normally stayed awake watching television long past midnight. My headlights swept across silent front yards that looked strangely abandoned despite dozens of cars sitting in driveways. Even the porch lights had gone out all at once. The only sound came from my truck engine echoing through the empty neighborhood. I slowed almost instinctively as I approached my own house. Cooper's barking suddenly erupted from inside with such desperation that I nearly jumped out of my seat. He wasn't barking at the front door. He was barking at one of the upstairs windows. I looked up just in time to see a dark silhouette standing behind the curtain before it slowly disappeared into the room. I grabbed the tire iron from underneath my driver's seat before running toward the front porch, barely remembering to lock the truck behind me. My heart pounded so violently that every breath felt painful. The front door was still locked exactly as I had left it, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere around the frame. I unlocked it with shaking hands and stepped inside, calling Cooper's name as loudly as I could. The barking stopped instantly. A silence so complete settled over the house that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I switched on every light as I moved from room to room with the tire iron raised in front of me. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing appeared stolen, yet the entire house felt occupied by something I couldn't see.
When I finally reached the staircase leading upstairs, Cooper emerged from the hallway with his ears pinned flat against his head and immediately pressed himself against my leg instead of running ahead like he normally would. His body trembled so violently that I could feel it through my jeans. I knelt to comfort him, but he refused to take his eyes off the second floor. Slowly, one step at a time, we climbed the staircase together. Every wooden step creaked beneath my weight. Halfway up, I noticed something wet dripping onto the stairs from above. At first, I assumed the roof had started leaking because of the storm. Then I touched the liquid with my fingers. It wasn't rainwater. It was fresh mud, as though someone had walked through soaked earth before entering my house. The muddy footprints continued across the upstairs hallway toward my bedroom, each print unnaturally long and narrow, almost too large to belong to any ordinary human being. I followed them, with Cooper staying close enough to brush against my leg with every cautious step. The hallway suddenly felt colder than the rest of the house, and every breath became visible in front of my face, despite the thermostat still reading 72 degrees. The bedroom door stood partially open. It moved ever so slightly back and forth, even though every window upstairs remained closed. I tightened my grip on the tire iron before pushing the door fully open with one quick movement. The room appeared completely empty. Then I looked down. The muddy footprints stopped in the exact center of the floor, without leading anywhere else. For several long seconds, neither Cooper nor I moved because every instinct told us something was terribly wrong, even though there was nothing visible inside the room. Then Cooper began growling again, but this time he wasn't looking at the doorway or the closet. He was staring directly at the ceiling above my bed. My eyes slowly followed his gaze upward. At first, I saw nothing except the old white ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. Then the fan stopped by itself. Hanging upside down above it, clinging to the ceiling without any visible support, was a tall, black figure with unnaturally long arms folded against its body. Its head slowly rotated until it faced directly toward me. It had no eyes, no mouth, only endless darkness where a face should have been. Then it smiled anyway. Every muscle in my body locked with pure terror as the impossible creature unfolded itself from the ceiling with slow, deliberate movements that sounded like old tree branches snapping one after another, while Cooper exploded into furious barking and lunged forward without hesitation, despite being completely outmatched by whatever stood before us. The instant Cooper leaped, every light in the house went out simultaneously, plunging us into absolute darkness, so complete that I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. Somewhere, only a few feet away, I heard claws scraping slowly across the hardwood floor. Cooper continued barking for exactly 3 more seconds before suddenly falling silent. Then I heard footsteps approaching me through the darkness. They were far too heavy to belong to my dog. They stopped directly in front of me. A cold breath touched my face, and a familiar whisper filled the room. "Now you finally see me." For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen in complete darkness with the tire iron clutched so tightly that my hands had gone numb, because every instinct told me that the slightest movement might reveal exactly where I was standing to whatever had just whispered inches from my face. The air around me suddenly became unnaturally cold, so cold that every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice straight into my lungs. I could no longer hear Cooper, which terrified me more than the creature itself, because my dog had never abandoned me, not even during thunderstorms or fireworks. Somewhere across the bedroom, the floorboards let out a slow, deliberate creak, followed by another, and then another, as though something impossibly tall was circling me without ever rushing. I strained to hear where it might be, but the sound seemed to come from every direction at once. My heartbeat thundered inside my ears until it drowned out almost everything else. Then, without warning, every sound stopped completely. The silence became so overwhelming that I could actually hear my own pulse echoing through the room. Out of that silence came a single whisper spoken directly behind me. "Don't turn around." Every horror movie I'd ever laughed at suddenly felt painfully real, because I knew that if I spun around, I might see something that would never leave my mind again. Yet the urge to look became almost unbearable as my imagination painted increasingly horrifying images of what could be standing only inches behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut, even though the room was already pitch black, trying to focus on breathing instead of panicking. My phone, which had fallen from my pocket sometime during the chaos, suddenly lit up on the floor near the bed. The bright screen became the only source of light in the room. At first I felt relieved. Then I noticed the camera application had opened by itself. Instead of showing the floor where it was lying, the screen displayed me standing perfectly still in the middle of the room. Behind me stood the same towering figure, its long arms hanging almost to the floor. The creature slowly leaned closer toward the back of my head, yet when I resisted every instinct and refused to turn around, I realized something impossible. The room behind me was completely empty. The present, it was showing something else entirely, something that seemed to exist just beyond what my own eyes could perceive. And as I stared at the screen, the creature slowly lifted one impossibly long finger before placing it where its lips should have been, silently telling me not to make a sound. Then another figure appeared beside it, then another. Within seconds, the phone screen showed half a dozen identical shadows surrounding me in a perfect circle, while in reality, I could still hear nothing moving around me at all. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached toward the phone without taking my eyes off the display. The instant my fingers touched it, the image changed. Instead of showing the bedroom, it displayed the abandoned bus stop. Sitting alone on the weathered bench was a little girl wearing an old yellow raincoat.
She slowly looked up at the camera and whispered, "You're not the one they wanted." Before I had time to understand what those words meant, every light in the house suddenly burst back to life all at once, nearly blinding me after so many minutes in total darkness. I looked around the bedroom in disbelief. The creature was gone. The muddy footprints had disappeared. The air felt warm again, as though nothing unusual had ever happened. Cooper came running into the room from the hallway, barking wildly before stopping beside me and wagging his tail in confused relief. For several long seconds, I honestly questioned my own sanity. Maybe exhaustion had finally caught up with me. Maybe I'd imagined the entire experience. Then I noticed something lying on my bedroom floor exactly where the creature had been standing. It was a small, muddy child's rain boot. I carefully picked up the tiny boot using the sleeve of my jacket because I had no intention at touching it directly with my bare hands, and the moment I lifted it, a terrible smell of wet earth and stagnant water filled the room so strongly that Cooper immediately backed away while whining nervously. The boot looked decades old, its faded yellow rubber cracked from age, yet it was still soaked as though it had just been pulled from a muddy ditch. Inside the boot was a folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The paper appeared much newer than the boot itself. Across the front, written in shaky black ink, were 6 simple words: "Find where she never came home." There was no signature, no date, only those words.
This story reminds us that not every mystery should be ignored, but curiosity always comes with a price. Fear can cloud our judgment, yet courage often begins when we choose to face the unknown instead of running from it. It also shows that some tragedies leave lasting scars, and forgotten victims deserve to be remembered. The protagonist survives not because he is fearless, but because he refuses to give up when confronted with the impossible. Above all, the story suggests that evil often grows in silence, while truth waits for someone brave enough to uncover it, even if doing so changes them forever.